Hello there, 8th graders, and welcome to another Science Note review, this time for all of our Big Idea B topics. And so we'll just put away our Tra-la-la Guitar Hero, and yes, they are just that awesome, they have that. And we're going to take a look at one of our first questions in the B questions, Big Idea B, and that, of course, would be about all of our dead old farts. So what I have for you is a quick PowerPoint. It's the same notes that you had before. Remember, you just need to have 3 of the facts for each of these dead old farts. And which 3 are entirely up to you. So if we start first, we've got Pythagoras, who lived in 500 BC. And some of the things that he thought and did, well, he was one of the earliest people to say that the Earth was round. He did, however, think that everything orbited the Earth in perfect spheres or circles. And so he was very geocentric in that way. He thought that the universe followed an ordered and regular pattern, what we would call cosmos, instead of a random universe with no patterns and laws. And that, of course, would be the opposite of cosmos, which is chaos. And there was this secret cult, this Brotherhood of Pythagoras, and they did some kind of crazy things. And one of the crazier parts was that the Pythagoreans thought that ideas were more important than observations and facts. And so that led to some pretty crazy ideas. So for example, one of their cooler ideas was that they thought the universe was made up of pure whole numbers. And so that nature is mathematical and the world could be understood and described through mathematical precision, numbers, whole numbers, which is kind of true. Maybe not the whole number part, but a lot of it is. He also believed that numbers had personalities like masculine, feminine, some numbers he thought represented wisdom, curiosity. So yeah, a little bit odd there. And he and his followers allegedly, famously, threw one of their fellow Pythagoreans overboard into the ocean for discussing and discovering that some numbers were irrational, or in other words, they cannot be expressed as a fraction or a ratio. And apparently that's pretty bad if you're a Pythagorean. And then to wrap a few more things up here about Pythagoras, he thought that shapes controlled different things, different elements like earth, wind, and fire, and you can see those shapes over on the right-hand side. And of course, the dodecahedron, the 5th shape, he thought controlled the cosmos, the universe, which is a little odd. And he thought that the dodecahedron was too powerful for common people to know about. So kind of a mixed bag of some cool ideas and some crazy ideas. And so we're going to move on to Democritus next. Democritus lived in 400 BC. He thought that everything was made up of small, undividable particles that he called atoms, which is essentially correct. He believed that there were all these different materials out there and they were made of different atoms. So it was the atoms that gave the materials their property. He thought there were water atoms, and those would be slippery and smooth like water is, or iron atoms would be solid and strong. And it's not exactly the way it works, but it's the same kind of idea. And then there were some other things that Democritus thought. He thought that the universe began as just atoms in empty space, and that as the atoms collided, they got larger and larger and eventually created the Earth, which is in essence what we think nebulas do nowadays. Democritus thought that there were other worlds in space, and some of them would have life and others would be lifeless. He also thought that those worlds might have no moons or sun, or they might have many different moons or suns. And he thought that each world had a beginning and an end, which is also true. And then he also believed that the Milky Way was made of distant stars and not milk. And the Milky Way is this band of light that we see across our sky. And then to wrap up the Democritus notes, he had this reputation as being the laughing philosopher. Because he never took life too seriously. At least that was the reputation he had, which would explain all the creepy, weird paintings of him always smiling and giggling and, for some reason, pointing at things too. Next, we have Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes lived in 200 BC. He proved that the Earth was a sphere, and I use that word very carefully. He proved it through shadows and sticks and calculations. He accurately calculated the circumference of the Earth. That would be its size. And he was only off by 2%, so he was 98% accurate. And he also suggested sailing west from Egypt to reach India and China, which is pretty darn clever. And then just to wrap up some Eratosthenes facts, he created one of the earliest known maps of the world, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner right there. Certainly it's missing North and South America, but it's one of the earliest attempts, and so it should be applauded. He later became the third librarian, chief librarian for the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. So a very prestigious thing. And then we have Aristarchus. Aristarchus lived around the same time, 200 BC. First person to say that the sun was the center of the earth, and and the earth and the other planets went around it. So a heliocentric model instead of a geocentric one. And he knew the correct order of the planets out to Saturn. He knew Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. He didn't know about the others because nobody knew about them. You have to have a telescope to see those other planets. And then to wrap up some Aristarchus stuff, he also believed that the sun was much larger than the Earth and the moon, and that it had to be much further away than the moon is from us, which again is essentially all correct. We then jump to 100 AD, and our next doodle fart is Ptolemy. Ptolemy, again, was kind of a mixed bag, a lot like Pythagoras. He had good ideas and bad. Good thing that he did was he mapped and named nearly every visible star in the night sky. And that's quite a few of them. He cataloged 48 different constellations, all of which are still used today. And he could predict eclipses with great accuracy, which, kind of a cool thing. Lunar eclipses, solar eclipses. But then he also had a few unusual ideas. For example, he thought that he came up with the whole zodiac or astrology business. So your horoscope, depending on, if you're a Leo or a Virgo, Sagittarius, he's the guy who came up with all of that. And of course, that, unfortunately, is still believed by many people today. He also worked really hard to prove that the Earth was the center of the solar system, the geocentric model, which of course is completely wrong. And his hard work paid off by causing astronomy to waste 1,000 years with the wrong model for how the solar system works. So we salute you, Ptolemy. Thank you for giving us the wrong idea. And then to wrap up with Ptolemy, he worked at the Library of Alexandria, which kind of a cool thing. Then we get to Hypatia, probably a pretty well-known dead old fart. She was a mathematician, astronomer, and the last chief librarian for the Great Library of Alexandria. Together, Hypatia and her father worked on and co-wrote many books on mathematics and astronomy. We also know that Hypatia was an educated female, which was extremely rare for 400 AD. She was the head of a philosophy school. She was also the last librarian for the Great Library of Alexandria. All very unusual for a woman of her time period. And so that's what makes her so cool. Hypatia was attacked on her way to work in 415 AD. She was skinned alive by a fanatical mob of early Christians who were kind of whipped up into this frenzy because they felt like she was dangerous, had too much influence over the governor of Alexandria. His name was Orestes. And so they attacked her and they killed her. And what was left of her remains were burnt in the streets. So kind of a brutal and sad end to a pretty amazing person. We then need to jump about 1,000 years to get to the 1500s, and we have Copernicus. He rediscovered the idea that the sun was at the center of the universe, and he got the idea from reading about Aristarchus. And what do we also know about this? Well, at first Copernicus gave Aristarchus credit for this idea in an early rough draft of his book, but then he crossed it out and never made that in the final draft. So I guess that does make him a bit of a plagiarist. But even so, he did a lot of cool things. He kind of reignited science again back in the 1500s and got us back on the right path. And so that his book did cause a big stink with a lot of people. It was banned by the church for nearly 250 years. So it caused a bit of a stir. And then that brings us to our good old friend Sheldon Cooper Kepler here. And so Kepler lived in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And we learned a lot about Kepler already in class, but we know that Kepler read about and fell in love with Copernicus's idea of the sun being at the center of the universe. And he really wanted to figure it all out. He wanted to know the true shapes of orbits and what drove everything out there. And he realized that it's not circular, it's instead oval shaped. And of course, Kepler came up with 3 laws to describe how orbits work. These laws are still used today. We use them every time we launch a satellite into space, every time we observe a moon going around a planet or a planet going around a star or stars going around each other. They always obey Kepler's laws. So I think that's pretty cool too. And Without all of the satellite stuff, our world would be so much different. So Kepler's one of those rare people that really directly impacts us. He even wrote one of the first science fiction stories. It was a story about traveling to the moon. It was called The Dream. And of course, we know that Kepler's mom got into some trouble and was put on trial for witchcraft. So yeah, it was a crazy time for Kepler, not an easy life for him. And then to wrap things up here with Galileo. Galileo lived in 1600s, used a telescope to see dark spots on the sun, mountains on the moon. He saw this giant red spot on Jupiter, which we now know today is a giant hurricane, and we still see it today, 500 years later. 4 moons going around Jupiter, he observed that, and he saw Venus going through different phases, which is very, very cool. And then to throw a few more things out there, he was arrested and put on trial by the church, the arm of the church known as the Spanish Inquisition. Put on trial for heresy, which is a religious crime, and eventually he was able to negotiate a plea agreement in order to save his life. He was forced to say that the sun went around the earth, so he had to say that he believed in the geocentric model and that all of his observations with the telescope were wrong. And he was also excommunicated or thrown out of the church as part of that plea agreement. And then Galileo spent the rest of his life under house arrest and being restricted from communicating with people or traveling to places. And his excommunication was revoked in the early 1990s, so about 400 years later, which, hey, cool. All right, so that's our dead old farts. And if I go back to our ISN, then that's, I mean, probably 1 or 2 pages right there with your timeline. Question B3 is all about the Library of Alexandria. And you can see, of course, that it was much more than a library. It had gardens, it had a zoo, an astronomical observatory for mapping the stars. It had dissecting rooms. It had over 1 million handwritten books. It had plays, history books, science books, mathematics books. The thing lasted for 700 years. It was built in 300 BC and destroyed in 400 AD. And of course, we know that the library was destroyed and burned to the ground shortly after Hypatia's death. And we had to wait more than 1,000 years before science would make a comeback. So this really marked the beginning of the Dark Ages, as you could probably see on your timeline. And then to wrap up here, B1, remember we did these out of order, and that's totally my fault. But question B1 was about why do people usually react to new ideas the way they do? Why do they go kind of crazy when a great new idea is brought forward? And why do we reject things like that? And so we had that paradigm video that we watched, and I think the paradigm video sheet sums it up really great. But I would review the paradigm terms with you. Remember, a paradigm is simply a way of thinking. It's a model for how we expect the world to work. And it establishes rules for how we're supposed to see things. And it tells us how to be successful within those rules. And we have paradigms about everything. We have paradigms about gender and what are the right kind of jobs for men and for women. We talked about that. We have paradigms about old people and young people. I'm sure there are political paradigms, religious paradigms, scientific paradigms. If you have an opinion, then you have a paradigm. Now, the paradigm effect is something you have to be careful of, because the paradigm effect is when your paradigm can alter things coming into your head to make it fit your paradigm, and it can cause you to not see things that contradict your paradigm. So it's kind of a blind spot for us. So it's when we change and alter things to match our own paradigm, or we ignore them. Paradigm paralysis, it's when your paradigm becomes the only paradigm, the only way to look at things. And we know that that's dangerous, because then you become closed-minded. And that's not a good way to spend your life thinking. And then a paradigm pioneer is someone who is on the edge, on the fringe, and they're the first people to embrace and accept a new idea. And a lot of our dead old farts were paradigm pioneers, because they were able to see things in new ways that no one had ever thought of and looked at before. So those are our Big Idea B questions. And so it's right there for you to see. And of course, Big Idea B, you could probably guess it right now, it's that people hate change, even when that change is good. And so we need to be able to accept and be open to change. So there it all is in a nutshell. It's kind of a long one here, but we had a lot of stuff to cover and go over. So that's Big Idea B. Tune in again soon for Big Idea C and the note reviews there. So good luck to you. Good luck on your dead old fart videos, and we'll see you in class. Bye now.